Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me along to talk to you this evening. This evening we're going to be talking about addiction. My name is Dr. Matt Parker. I'm a senior lecturer in neuroscience and pharmacology at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm particularly interested in addiction. The talk I'm going to give tonight is really based on what we know about addiction at the moment in terms of the way that addiction can be characterized, the way that addiction is sort of understood from a scientific perspective. And I've called the talk Addiction from Genes to Brain to Behavior and Environment, because obviously, you know, the subject matter of tonight's film, Honey Boy, really brings home the impact that the environment can have on people, especially in terms of their sort of neuropsychiatric development, if you like. So really what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of really understanding addiction is all of the different kind of underlying factors that seem to be involved with addiction, and really kind of unpackage that and try and explain it a little bit more. I guess one of the first things to think about is that, you know, addiction touches most people's lives to some extent. You know, we're constantly, I don't want to say bombarded because it's probably the wrong term to use, but we're surrounded in our lives with information about addiction, information about the harms of drugs, information about the harms of using different substances. So we know very well that these substances are potentially bad for us, potentially harmful, and our children know this. And those around us know, you know, and there's been a long history of trying to help people overcome addiction. And there's also been, you know, a big push within the press to try to make sure that people are aware of the dangers of drugs. But of course, it's not just illegal drugs. As you can see, obviously, there are legal drugs, as we know, alcohol and cigarettes and so on as well. But we also know that, you know, because of this this tragedy of substance abuse, we've lost, you know, various people, well-known people. So these are just a picture of a few people that have succumbed to substance abuse. Amy Winehouse died a few years ago at the age of 27. George Best, well-known footballer, of course, died after many, many years of alcohol abuse and liver transplants and cirrhosis and so on. And Whitney Houston, the pop singer, also died from drug-related issues. So we know that there's a rich history of celebrities and other people, you know, non-celebrities and so on, and also Shia LaBeouf, who is obviously the subject of the Honey Boy that we've just watched. You know, there's a long history of substance abuse, especially, you know, right the way through society. And the way that people think about substance abuse and addiction is often quite politicized, often quite polarized. So depending on who you read, so to speak, you know, some newspapers and some I guess media outlets are much more likely to push the sort of negative sides of drugs, are much more likely to sort of peddle the narrative that that drugs are dangerous and that they cause harm and so on to the individual. And then there's the other side of it, which is perhaps about you know, looking for ways of decriminalizing drugs and changing the kind of narrative around drugs. Of course, the most dangerous drugs that are used in society arguably are tobacco and alcohol, and both of these two are legal. And in fact, David Nutt, who is portrayed in the picture on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, he was the government's chief drugs advisor a few years ago. But when he raised concerns about current drug legislation and raised this obvious issue that is, look, one of the most dangerous drugs around is alcohol in terms of the damage it does to individuals and in terms of the damage it does to society. That drug is widely available, cheap and easy to get hold of, and yet we're criminalizing drugs that perhaps don't have such negative consequences to their users. And he was sacked from the government for having that view, or from the government's advisory panel. So there really is a very strong polarization, actually political polarization, between the way that people talk about drugs. So let's have a think about addiction. I mean, despite what we may think about drugs, and I include alcohol in that and tobacco, despite what we might think about drugs, addiction is really a separate issue. And it's a separate issue because addiction doesn't care whether the drug is legal or not. addiction cares about nothing but the individual who is affected by it. And so therefore, whatever the drug is that people choose, and in fact, obviously addiction can can relate to non-substances as well. So, obviously people may be addicted to gambling and to other things, but we're going to talk about it in terms of substance dependence tonight because it's relevant to the film we've just watched. So I guess the kind of clinical definition of addiction or substance dependence is the syndrome of substance misuse that leads to adverse consequences and includes a cluster of symptoms such as tolerance, withdrawal, and an inability to stop using. Now, there's a few things that we need to unpackage there. The first thing is, okay, we're talking about substance dependence here. This does work for other non-substances, but really for this conversation, we're talking about substances. It leads to adverse consequences. Adverse consequences means that it has a negative influence or a negative impact on that person's life. Now, that might be in terms of familial discord. It might be in terms of losing a job. It might be financial problems, but it has, and of course, health problems, but it has some sort of adverse consequences. Substance dependence also will have a cluster of symptoms such as, so it doesn't have to have these, and this is important because if you think that somebody who is addicted has to be, suffering withdrawal symptoms and so on, that's probably not true in all cases. It may have symptoms such as tolerance and withdrawal, especially opiate drugs and alcohol, for example. You may build up a kind of physiological dependence after you develop tolerance for those drugs, which means that your body doesn't really function appropriately without that drug, which means that you may need to take that drug in order to feel normal. But also, and critically, an inability to stop using. And it's that inability to stop using that I really want to concentrate on this evening. Now, what I mean by an inability to stop using is a state that someone gets into in which they engage in a number of different things. So the first thing is compulsive behavior. So I must get hold of the drug. A loss of control, which means I'm unable to stop taking the drug. And a loss of interest, which means I'm not interested in anything else except taking this drug. Now, these are the critical kind of psychological and behavioral features of addiction that are central to what that experience is about. And if you think about that in terms of the way that it kind of encompasses somebody's life, you can understand how all-encompassing addiction can be. I must get that drug. I don't have a choice. I must get it. I'm not able to stop. I want to stop, maybe. I'd like to stop, but that's not going to happen. I'm not able to do it. A loss of interest in other things. I don't care about anything else. I'm not interested in work. I'm not interested in food. I'm not interested in my partner. I'm not interested in my friends. All I care about is getting hold of that drug and any means possible in order to do it. And, the extent to which any of those are the case with an individual is really the extent to which that addiction has kind of taken over their lives. So we know about addiction, we know what it is, we've just explained it in a clinical sense, but what causes addiction? And this is a much harder question to answer. And what we're going to do for the rest of this talk is really think about what some of those causal factors are and really start unpacking the evidence for what those causal factors are. The first one, and this is fairly obvious really after having just watched that movie, is the environment. Familial environment, for example. What influence does our family have? What influence does our friends and family have? To what extent is peer pressure important? To what extent do we take influences from our friends online, from our role models, from people that we look up to, even from people that we just interact with? What about our work colleagues? If we, how does that environment around us impact on addiction? Well, the fact of the matter is that it does have an influence and it does cause some difficulties, and in a little while we're going to think a little bit about what those are. And I want to really, before we start thinking about some of those kind of environmental influences, I want to start thinking about some of the underlying issues. So what about genetics? So we know that the heritability, so in other words, the amount of likelihood it is that we're going to inherit alcohol use disorder, for example, So my topic area is alcohol, so that's really what my main concentration for tonight will be. We know that the heritability of alcohol use disorder is around 50%. So that means if you have an identical twin that has an alcohol use disorder, the likelihood that you will also have an alcohol use disorder is around 50%. Okay, so the reason this is, there's various different reasons why things might be inherited, but really the way we tend to think about it is in terms of our genes and in terms of sort of genetic variation. So just to give you a little bit of background on this, our genome, so in other words, all the genes that are in our whole kind of our whole body's makeup, is divided into 23 pairs of chromosomes. And in each pair, we inherit one from our mother and one from our father. So hopefully everybody knows that. And this is the 23 pairs of chromosomes that we have. So we have 22 pairs of normal chromosomes, and we have the sex chromosomes. So depending on whether we're male or female. Now, each of our chromosomes is made up from DNA. Okay, so that DNA is wound up very tightly inside our chromosomes. The DNA is made up by millions of pairs of what we call single nucleotide bases. And these are made up of one of 4 different nucleotides. And they're shortened to A, T, C, and G. That's the kind of the first letter in the word of what they are, which I won't bore you with. Okay, so our DNA is made up of millions and millions of pairs of these particular nucleotides. And there's only 4 nucleotides, and they can be organized in all kinds of different ways. But they're always paired. Together. Now, if you imagine you have a situation whereby basically everybody has these nucleotides, these pairs. Now, sometimes what happens is that a certain person will have, or certain people, or some space within the genome will have what we call a genetic variant. And that means that while one person has a G, the other person will have a pair of Cs. So this person has got a C and a G, and this person has got 2 Cs, and this person has got 2 Gs, and this person has got a C and a G. So all of the other nucleotide pairs within that bit of the genetic material is the same, but we have this one genetic variant. Now, these genetic variants are incredibly common right the way through all of us. So we all have these genetic variants, okay? They're called single nucleotide polymorphisms, and we all have lots and lots of them. But some of these genetic variants can actually tell us quite a lot about disease, because what happens is that sometimes people that have a particular genetic variant, so here in this example, we've got 3 people, Dave, Ed, and Nick, and they all have this particular genetic variant, which is at 0.35, which is either 2 Cs, a C and a T, or 2 Ts, okay? So you can imagine these are just 3 normal people, but they have this particular genetic variant. Now, in terms of alcohol, what we know is that people that have a particular genetic variant show a much higher likelihood to develop alcohol use disorder, so actually develop alcohol addiction. So if you imagine here in our genotype example, we have this person, Dave, who has this genotype, CC, this person, Ed, who has this one, CT, and this person, Nick, who has this one, which is TT. Now imagine Nick has an alcohol problem, but Dave and Ed don't. Now, if we look at this on a really large scale, and we look at hundreds of thousands of people's genomes, we often see these single nucleotide polymorphisms, these single changes within the genome, have a relationship to a particular disorder. And in fact, with alcohol, we know that there are several genes that are very closely related to alcohol use disorder and substance abuse. Now, 3 of these genes here, ADH1B, ADH1C, and ADH5, these genes, so these single nucleotide polymorphisms, are all related to an enzyme. And that enzyme is called alcohol dehydrogenase. And what that enzyme does is it breaks down alcohol. So when you drink alcohol, your body metabolizes it using this enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. And alcohol dehydrogenase breaks alcohol down into acetaldehyde and then into acetate. Now, there is some evidence that people that have alcohol problems seem to have this nucleotide polymorphism, this change in their genome in these particular alcohol dehydrogenase genes. Now, what that tells us is that not interestingly, that this particular gene or these genes or these polymorphisms are related to addiction, what they tell us is that these people metabolize alcohol differently. Now, if you take a moment to think about that, what that suggests is that genetically, Nick here, so who has this particular version of the polymorphism, may metabolize alcohol differently from Ed and Dave. And what that tells you is that it might be that Nick can just drink more. So in fact, Nick drinks more alcohol than Ed and Dave, or is able to cope better with drinking alcohol because he's got a different way of metabolizing it. Maybe Nick doesn't get hangovers, for example. There's some evidence that people who are substance abusers or alcohol abusers don't suffer with hangovers, which means that they're more likely to drink more regularly. So you can see from this particular genetic difference that we're not talking about necessarily a genetic difference that leads to addiction, so that inability to stop, that compulsive behavior, but actually potentially a polymorphism or a genetic difference that leads to some difference in the way that our bodies deal with that particular drug. Now, there are several other polymorphisms, so several other genetic differences that we know impact on addiction. And a couple of these I'm going to talk about now, because actually these tie into something very different, which actually might be slightly more related to addiction. So those two genetic differences tie into a particular behavioral trait that we see in people that suffer with addiction. And that particular behavioral trait is called impulsivity. Now, what impulsivity is the inability or the lack of ability or the lack of likelihood of being able to kind of withhold doing something that you want to do. Now, if you look at the picture on the top left-hand corner of the little boy with the marshmallow, some of you might be familiar with the marshmallow test. This is where you, usually with children, say to them, you can eat this marshmallow right now, or you can wait for 5 minutes and then you can have 2 marshmallows. And you can see from the pained expression on that young lad's face, that just sitting there staring at that marshmallow is extremely difficult. Now, people that have low levels of kind of response inhibition, so the ability to withhold that response and are more impulsive, are more likely to say, you know what, I'm just going to eat this single marshmallow now. I'm not going to wait for the 2 or 3 marshmallows in 10 minutes. I'm just going to go ahead and eat this marshmallow now. Another type of impulsivity is what we call impulsive action. And this is the inability to stop once you've started doing something. A good example of this comes from cars. So I don't know how many of you have a car with a keyless entry system. So my car just has this kind of black button. It has no key. And so all I do is I press the button and then it's in my pocket or whatever. And then when I get in the car, I just press a button and drive away. Now, obviously, I drove for 30 years without one of these. And so every so often I will go to put a key in the ignition and think, oh, I haven't got a key. What am I doing? That kind of impulsive action, that where you're just going to do something without really thinking about it, people that have sort of low levels or high levels of impulsivity are more likely to do that kind of thing. So have this kind of, carry on with a behavior, even though that behavior is not appropriate in that scenario. Now, we know from some research from people at Cambridge, so Jeff Daly and various others at Cambridge, that people who are drug users have much higher rates of impulsivity than people in the general population. Now, what's really interesting about impulsivity, and the reason I'm linking this back to the genetics that I was talking about before, is that if you notice on this graph, the siblings of drug users who are in the middle here, and bear in mind, these are siblings who are not drug users. That's the really important thing. These aren't siblings that also take drugs. These are non-drug using siblings. What you see is that drug users have a higher rate of impulsivity than normal people, than non-drug users, but their siblings, so the drug users' siblings, have higher rates of impulsivity also than non-sibling, non-drug users. So if we unpackage that, what that means, or what it appears to suggest, is that not only do drug users themselves have more high rates of impulsivity, but also their first degree relatives do, their siblings, which means that that impulsivity might be some kind of underlying genetic trait, which when in the correct environment, so with the right kinds of, or the wrong kinds of environmental pressures, that might then develop into drug use in some people. So I wanted to go back now. Now we've talked about some of the underlying factors. I already said, look, what about the family? We talked about that at the beginning, but let's kind of revisit that now. Now we understand that some people, particularly people who are more impulsive and people who have the right kind of genetics in terms of their, their metabolism of the drugs, what kinds of environmental effects might impact them? Well, there are two things that I want to talk to you about. The first is what we call social learning theory. Now, social learning theory was first adapted by this chap here in the picture called Albert Bandura. And essentially what he was interested in is whether children learn inappropriately by watching other people learn. And what Bandura found was that he put the, he basically showed the kids a video. So the video at the top here, it's not a video I've got, it's just a still picture of somebody interacting with this big kind of, they called it a Bobo doll. It was a bit like Mr. Blobby. I don't know how many of you remember Mr. Blobby from back in the 90s on Noel's house party. Mr. Blobby was a great big kind of plump orange pink sort of blob essentially that wandered around making silly noises, and a Bobo doll was a bit similar to him. So it had a weighted bottom and it would just kind of fall over. And what Bandura wanted to know is if you showed children videos of somebody interacting in a really violent way with this Bobo doll, like smacking it around, or interacting calmly with it, and then put the children in a room, what would they do? And what Bandura found was that the children tended to mimic what they'd seen. So we know that from quite an early age, children will tend to, if they don't really know what to do in a particular situation, they will mimic what they see others doing, particularly adults. We also know that the influence that parents versus friends have over a child is very strongly a function of age. So obviously when a child is young, under the age of sort of 12 or 13, the familial influence, the parental influence is very strong. So children have a very strong influence on their parents in those early formative years. But as soon as they hit high school age, sort of 13, 14, then that influence shifts very, very quickly towards their friends and other people. And actually, when it kind of balances out in young adulthood, the influence that the parents have might catch up a little bit, but their friends and others around them have a much stronger influence. So the kind of social environment that is kind of formative in this potential kind of addiction state is very strongly parental at first, but moves much more strongly to the family and others as people get older. So really just to kind of summarize what I've talked about, I want to show you this cycle of substance dependence. Now, this is something that, that is really based on lots of different bits of research, but kind of pulls into account all of the different things that we've talked about this evening. So on the left-hand side of the diagram, you've got the kind of testing part, the trying out part, the bit where you start experimenting with drugs. And again, this is something that you probably will tune into you based on the film that we've just watched. So when people first try drugs, there's a number of different things that can happen, right? They can either try drugs one time or a couple of times, and then they can maybe use them occasionally, and then they can abstain or, you know, use them from time to time and then kind of stop. That's one direction you can go in. Another direction you can go in, so from trying drugs on the left, you can go down to a kind of more regular habitual drug use. Now, I might include in this, drinking alcohol. You might, start drinking alcohol in, going out with your friends when you're younger or with parents when you're younger, and then you may end up drinking more regularly, even, every night of the week. Maybe it's a kind of habit. Maybe you drink a couple of nights a week. Maybe you drink 5 nights a week, 7 nights a week at a relatively low level. But there are those two different directions you can go in. And it does seem like there are two kind of key influences on that. One is novelty seeking. So it seems that people that are more risk taking, more kind of willing to go out and make risky decisions, are more likely to try drugs. This doesn't really have an impact on whether they carry on taking drugs, but people that are more risk taking, more risk prone, will be more likely to take drugs. You then have social and environmental influences. And this means that, you know, people in your social group, but parents as well, potentially, but also people within your kind of social group, friends and colleagues and so on, will also have an influence on that first part of that diagram, trying drugs and regular and habitual drug use. When we move into the cycle of addiction on the right, this is when people start moving into this part of the whole addiction process, whereby their regular and habitual drug use turns into what we would call substance dependence or addiction. And as you can see, apologies, that's a bit small. As you can see from that cycle of addiction, that cycle of dependence, it starts with compulsive drug use. It often then goes into withdrawal and treatment. So people may then decide, look, I'm going to stop taking the drugs, and they're going to go into treatment. But it's often punctuated with periods of relapse. Okay, so it's this idea that people take drugs for a while, they then go into treatment for whatever reason, they then maybe stop taking the drug for a while, and then they relapse. And that cycle of drug addiction, as it carries on, has increasing social, financial, and emotional consequences associated with it. And what seems to be absolutely key in this cycle of drug use and this shift from regular and habitual drug use is the genetics. And in fact, you know, the familial influence will have an impact, but actually people's genetics seems to be really key as to whether they enter this particular cycle of drug abuse and relapse. And it does seem likely, based on a lot of evidence, that impulsivity and people's impulse control, especially early in life, seems to be one of the strongest factors that predicts this. So a lot of research now is looking into trying to understand more about the biology of impulsivity in order to better understand drug use. So just before I finish, I just wanted to really, I guess, make it clear that whatever the underlying causes of drug addiction and whatever the underlying consequences and the impact that it has on people's lives, you know, however you decide to think about drug addiction in terms of what causes it, we need to be compassionate, and we need to understand that, you know, whatever has happened in people's lives, these drugs have a very powerful influence. And in fact, that feeling of loss of control and that feeling of inability to stop when you really want to, but you know, you can feel everything disappearing, you know, that feeling is something that we should all try and envisage in our minds, that happening to ourselves or to one of our loved ones. And for many of us, maybe it already has, and it has happened at various different levels. And I think what we need to do as a society, while we try and understand more about drug addiction, is to try to understand how best to treat it. And by doing this, I think we'll then get ourselves into a position one day where we're able to successfully treat people who have drug addiction in a way that really helps them to stop and to actually bring back some, some positive things within their lives. Thank you very much.